The town gathered like a settled hush around the plaza, voices folding into the heat until only the speaker's words were clear. Don Manuel Córdoba stood on the low stone wall beneath the mesquite, his hat in his hands, his voice used to bargain and to command. He told them the horse had been fouled so many times in the ways men speak of trouble, dangerous, unpredictable, that the best thing for the hacienda was to put the animal down. Then he spoke the alternative. 10 million pesos to whoever could sit the horse and lead it calm through the plaza by the end of 30 days. The money was a number big enough to rearrange lives. It fell into the dust like a coin. Sofía heard the coin fall. She could not see the plaza, the faces, the raised fists, or the silence that moved through the crowd like wind through the mesquite leaves. But her world had its own alphabet of sound. The scrape of someone shifting on a bench told her who had come nearer. The clack of a boot against cobble marked the tall men. The small, tinny laugh of a child meant someone trying to hide excitement. When Don Manuel, there in the center, said 10 million, she counted 3 steady beats between his last 2 words and tasted, absurdly, the metal of a coin against the back of her teeth. Memory doing the work of sight. At home, the tin under her bed remembered 10,000 lesser things. Maria kept it hidden in a folded rag, the coins clinking and muttering when the house floor breathed. Sofía had pressed her small fingers against the rim more times than she could count. When she had been 5 and they had no choice, Maria had scraped together what little she could for a visit to Dr. Salazar in the city, whispering promises of surgery that might give Sofía light in a voice like prayer. The doctor had said, carefully, that something could be done, but it would take money and travel and recovery. Sofía had learned then that numbers were small as stones and large as mountains. She cupped her hand to the cool tin and, without opening it, knew how the coins lay. 2 big ones, a handful of smaller ones, the single small coin with a chip like a tooth. She knew the scent that rose from the tin, a mixture of dust, old metal, lemon rind from Maria's cleaning water. She knew the night when she had wrapped a scrap of cloth around it and pressed it to her chest like a heart. The offer in the plaza curved toward them like a path. 10 million pesos, 30 days. The town's laughter that followed it was a sound Sofía could have described in 3 notes: surprise, derision, appetite. They did not laugh at Don Manuel. They laughed at the idea that anyone would try. A dangerous animal and the hacienda's ledger. The horse had already shoved into the corral wall last week. Ramon's arm still bore the memory of that day in a stiff, careful scar. "It'll kill a child," someone said, and the town nodded. The men counted their money in the plaza. The women whispered of the tin. Sofía decided quietly as night came. She decided while Maria bent over the hearth, stirring the pot with a worn wooden spoon and murmuring a rosary of worry. "No, mija," Maria said when the decision first left Sofía's mouth like a small bell. "They will not let a niña go near such a beast." Her voice was not just caution, it was love turning practical. They will not allow it. But Maria's no carried the weight of 1,000 practical yeses. She saw the tin. She heard Sofía's counting footsteps across the room as the girl paced and paced, soothing herself with numbers the way others might soothe themselves by tracing a photograph. The house itself, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, knew Sofía's rhythm: 3 steps from bed to door, 5 to the hearth, 6 to the back wall where the mesquite-scented evening came in. Sofía had practiced counting since she was very small. It steadied her the way a hand steadies a frightened bird. "If he will let me," Sofía said, simply, "I will go." Maria's fingers stopped their stirring. She turned and found the small, dark face, the shape of determination that did not need sight to be visible. "Dios querido," she breathed, half plea, half acceptance. "Then we ask him." A short paragraph is all the CTA needs to be. And so it is here. Stay with Sofía until the end of this story, through the 30 days of quiet advances and the noisy final test. And if you find your heart moved, let this tale reach others. Subscribe and like so more stories of compassion can be seen. After the thin invitation, the world narrowed again to Sofía's size. Don Manuel's terms were plain. The horse, referred to at first only as El Bravo, would remain in a corral the hacienda kept for animals that could not be tamed by the ordinary hands of the men who worked there. The judge of success would be not a private word between Sofía and Don Manuel, but a public walk through the plaza at the end of 30 days. The horse calm enough to accept a rider without a bridle or saddle. The men in the plaza murmured about the impossibility. The women clucked. Ramon spat into the dust and walked away. The horse lived behind the hacienda's low wall, in a space of sun and shade where the scent of sweat and manure lived in a long, slow partnership with the mesquite wood smoke. People avoided the corral. Even Paco, who wore his hair unruly and his grin wider than most, kept a respectful distance. They called the horse dangerous, and his body confirmed it. The arch of rib, a flank puckered with old rope scars. The thin muscle along his neck twitching now and then at imagined threats. He had the look of something that had learned to answer danger with its own fury. Sofía listened to those small, precise things. She listened to how the horse shifted the air when he breathed, how his nails tapped the compacted earth, how he snorted, a soft, wet instrument when people came too close. She learned the cadence of his worry, the rhythm of his startleness. One evening, sitting with Maria at the doorway when the sky cooled, Sofía put her hand up on the lattice and called, simply, "If you are there, tell me how you breathe." Her voice became a lullaby that she had made into a ritual. It had no melody that could be notated at a piano. It had instead the gentle roundedness of syllables, a pattern of sound that Sofía hummed to herself as she counted. The song began the same every night. 3 slow hums, then a rising hum of 2 notes, then the soft descending phrase that felt like a question. It was a song of neither words nor conquest. It was a song of invitation. Day 1. The town watched the gate when she stepped through it for the first time, wrapped in Maria's shawl and clutching the thin rope of a lead that was meant more for being held than for controlling. Don Manuel's men stood apart, hands on hips, their legs making small, stiff triangles as they whispered among themselves. Ramon watched too, his jaw a map of skepticism and some reluctant curiosity. Sofía counted the steps from the gate to the corral's fence. 1, 2, 3, 4. She tapped the post with the heel of her hand, feeling its grain. She inhaled manure and summer dust and the faint sweet of horse sweat. The horse looked up. Sofía felt the air shift and hummed the opening of her song. She did not approach with a rope's pull. She moved like a ripple. Small steps, kept measured by the old counting that had become a compass for her feet. The first day was all observation. Sofía sat against the warm wood, her back to the sun, and let the horse speak. He watched her too, ears flicking, calculating whether she was another threat. When a man clapped too loud across the yard, the horse reared, and the corral made a sound of wood striking wood. Sofía's heart thudded inside her ribs, but she breathed with the same slow rhythm she taught the song, and her hands, small, sure, folded into her lap. She discovered, in that quiet, how patient her own body had grown. Day 2 through 5. Little silences lengthened the way one wire is lengthened by slow heat. Sofía learned to place her presence like a stone in a stream, steady, unmoving, a place the water could not unsettle. She set a bowl of water by the fence and touched it with her fingers so she knew its place each day. She brought bits of stale bread for the horse, never sudden, never thrown. She counted the steps to the trough and back, always out loud now, so the cadence entered both their worlds. On day 3, he allowed his muzzle to hover near her fingers. His breath was hot and full of the scent of oats. Sofía felt the vibration of it on her knuckles and laughed. a sound that surprised the men leaning against the wall. "Quiet, Paco," Ramon would say at first. But even his voice softened when the horse lowered his head and let Sofia's hand rest on the hair behind his ears. The townspeople gave small wagers and smaller compliments. A woman passed by with a basket and spat a little respectful "que milagro" under her breath. Others only shook their heads and bet on how long before Sofia got hurt. The tin of coins under Sofia's bed seemed to pulse with possibility at each small advance. Each night she returned home and pressed the palm of her hand to the tin as if to ask permission to dream. Day 10. The first real test came when Sofia persuaded a man to open a gate and let her step into the corral. Don Manuel's rules had been strict. No child inside without supervision, no loud voices, no tricks. He had agreed, with a voice that was not soft and not unkind, to the arrangement on the condition that Ramon or one of the hacienda hands be present. On day 10, Ramon stood inside with his hands folded like an old tool at his belt, and Paco stayed near the gate with his hat turned over his heart. Sofia counted the steps in, measured them, and placed herself at the horse's shoulder. She did not try to persuade him to take a halter. Instead, she brushed his flank with the back of her hand. The hair there had a stringy pattern in it, a map of old rope that told a quiet story of panic and holding. The horse flinched. She hummed the song, a single line, the one that always began with 3 slow hums, and the horse exhaled a long breath that vibrated her forearm. "Don't lean on him," Ramon said to Paco, not to her. He had not expected the thing to pass the threshold of his own stubbornness, that something small and patient could touch what had been trained to bite and flee. He had broken colts before. He had set bones. He had walked away from animals and men who would not be changed. But Sofia's fingers on the horse felt to him at that moment like a different kind of tool, one he had not been taught to hold. By day 15, the blanket arrived. Sofia had noticed the way the horse flinched at sudden fabrics, at flags or banners the men sometimes used to move animals. She understood, with the bluntness of her senses, that the horse's whole life had been a stitched-up patchwork of shocks. So she carried a blanket, an old woven thing that Maria had once used the day she had come from the market, its threads smelling of lime and dust, and she laid it carefully across the fence where the horse could see, in scent and surface, that it was not a wave meant to frighten, but a thing that might become a familiar bed. It took days for the horse to accept the blanket. On day 12, he sniffed it and snorted and tossed his head. Sofia's hands had trembled then, but she counted and returned the blanket, folded, to the same place. On day 15, he allowed the blanket to touch him. He shook as if easing a memory from his spine, and then, slowly, with the painful slowness of something unlearning a reflex, he leaned down and rested his cheek against the woven fabric. Sofia's fingers on the blanket felt the horse's cheek move, the heat of it, the coarse whisker. She hummed and sang, 3 beats, then a rise and fall, and the men on the outside of the corral, Ramon, Paco, Don Manuel himself, shifted their weight and watched like sailors watching a tide change. Progress came in small accounting. The town counted the days like a calendar. Day 1, day 5, day 10, and in the back of every counting head was a wager and a fear. Sofia counted differently. She counted breaths. She marked the longing of the horse's exhale as a gain. She marked when he turned his face toward the sound of her voice without showing teeth. Each night she moved her fingers over the tin under the bed and felt as if the coins hummed back. There were setbacks. Once, on day 7, a boy who did not understand caution ran behind the corral and shrieked for mischief. The horse sprang forward and struck the wooden fence, splinters catching in his flank. Ramon cursed and smacked the wood with the butt of his hand. The men wanted to chase the animal and prove its danger. Sofia, who had been under a mesquite tree farther off, felt the shock like a missing note in a song. She walked to the fence and, with her hands, folded folded them into the crack where the splintered wood kept the echo of that day. She hummed to him, and he came, trembling to the sound. "Do not be a fool," Maria scolded later that night, though her voice shook with its own frightened admiration. "You could break your neck." "You will break your heart if I do not try," Sofía said. It was not defiantly, merely fact. One broken neck versus one heart rearranged. Maria did not say anything more because she understood both sides. She wrapped her arms around the small shoulders and let the girl count her way into sleep. Rain came twice in those weeks. First, a thin, hesitant mist that smelled of tin roofs and wet earth. Later, a heavier downpour washed the corral clean and made the horses shaggle. The mesquite trees took the water like a blessing and flexed their long limbs. People moved slower in the weather, voices dabbing at collars and hats. Sofía loved the rain for the way it changed the sounds. The steady drum on the roof, the smell of the town lifting like a prayer. She hummed in the rain, and the horse whickered within the shelter of the corral. And something about the two of them existed then like a small covenant. By day 22, a new threshold had been crossed. The horse, whose reactions had once been lightning and fury, lay down within the corral with a small, cautious folding of his legs. He did not sleep long, but the fact of his reclining was a ledger entry. A beast that once bristled at any closeness had accepted rest within a human-thoughted space. Sofía had been the one to bring the blanket into the pen that day. Her palms smoothed the coarse weave, and her voice, the same song, paced in triple beats. She counted each of his breaths aloud, slowly, as if to keep them anchored to a shore. People in the town began to place their bets differently. Where scorn had been loud, curiosity crept in like moss. Ramon stopped speaking to the men on the wall and began to stand beside Paco at the gate, his hands no longer folded but busy in his pockets. Don Manuel, who had first announced the prize with the clear arithmetic of commerce, came to the corral when he could, hat pulled low, and found his presence changing him. He would not say he was softer, but he did not grimace when Sofía's fingers were near the horse's ribs. The horse bore scars like a map of someone's hard history. Don Manuel's ledger bore numbers like explanations. Both began to feel less immutable. Sofía kept a notebook of sorts that no one else could read. She had tied a strip of cloth around her wrist with knots to mark the passing days, and tightened one every morning after she had counted the steps she would walk to the corral. She hummed the song as a metronome of patience. She learned the horse's peculiar tics, how he would lift one hind leg when a plane of shadow moved across the corral, how he would toss his head when voices rose too loud. She taught herself how to soften her breathing in response. There were conversations of other sorts behind the scenes. Don Manuel convened the officials who would be present for the final demonstration. Don Ignacio from the municipal office, a doctor who was more local than Dr. Salazar but still official, a scribe to write down the terms again. They spoke in low voices about liability and about what might happen if the child failed. Dr. Hernandez said, politely, that he wanted no child harmed for a wager. Don Manuel's face folded with calculation. "She is 10, he said. "She is blind." The two facts together had both horrified and, curiously, tempered the men's appetite for spectacle. It is one thing to risk a trained vaquero, it is another to risk a child. That thought moved across their faces like cloud. Sofía, who had no access to the administrative equation, only the horse, felt the town's attention like a current around her ankles. She learned to breathe against it. She and Maria went to see Dr. Salazar for the second time in those weeks, the old doctor who had told them of possible surgery. He listened to Sofía's life and felt the stubbornness in her voice. "There is a chance," he said, not giving promises. "A chance, with money and a surgeon in the city and a careful recovery. You will not wake up and see a picture book. It will be work." He wrote down names and dates, and the paper felt like a fragile raft. Sofía counted the days with a new urgency. Each knot on the cloth tightened as a promise to herself. The horse, the animal whose eyes she could not name, began to have a name in her mouth, a movement from El Bravo to a quieter, more human term. On a late evening when the sky was the color of the inside of a well, she whispered the word to the horse as she rested her hand on his warm flank and felt the faint thrum of his heart beneath the ribs. Esperanza, she said, hope, because that was what he had become, not simply an animal to be tamed or culled, but a chance. The name caught in the town like light catches on glass. Some called it sentimental. Some said it was a foolish name for something so full of old fury. The name stuck to him like the blanket stuck to his flank. It softened the edges of his violence, because to call something hope is to be compelled to see not only what it had been, but what it might become. Day 26. The corral had become a theater of small routines. The town's wagers shifted into the language of attendance. People came by not to mock, but to witness the work of two patients, a child with the interior brightness of counting, and a horse with the slow business of relearning trust. Sofía practiced mounting by stepping onto a low log near the fence and placing her palm on the horse's withers. The hands of men steadied the horse's head in the background, an adult presence that both honored the rule and contained the risk. When she placed both hands flat and leaned forward as if to rest on a mare's broad back, Esperanza did not snort away. The animal simply stood, an enormous thing holding itself steady at the tender insistence of a girl's touch. Day 29 brought an anxiety that tasted like iron. With one day left, the entire town felt like a lung full of air, waiting to see if the breath would go out calm or with a startled gasp. Don Manuel moved with more attention. He checked that the plaza would be cleared of stray obstacles and that the men who worked at El Mesquite would stand back and not interfere. Dr. Hernandez made a circuit of the corral and nodded as if to himself. Ramon came by and, for the first time in a long time, left a small, bent offering at the corral gate. A strip of leather, well-oiled, placed where Sofía would find it. He did not say he had faith. He only looked at her and nodded. It was a small miracle of his own making. At night, Sofía hummed the song as she had every night. 3 slow hums, the rise and the fall, and wrapped her hand once, twice, 3 times around the tin's rim. She thought of the surgeon's hands in the city, of the hospital smelling of disinfectant and paper, of the slow opening that might be light. She imagined seeing, in small amounts, the color of Maria's hair, the dark leather of Ramon's hands, the color of the mesquite leaves. The thought made her smile in the dark. She dreamed, too, of Esperanza's eye, of the glossy surface she had never seen but had learned to trust. In dreams, the horse's flinch became a slow, easy nod. In dreams, the town clapped, but not in mockery. They clapped the way hands clap to say a prayer. On the morning of day 30, the plaza was full in a way the town had rarely been. People came early on donkeys, on foot, carrying babies on their hips. They brought chairs and sat in a ring like a human sun. Some stood at windows of the officials' houses. The air smelled of corn and of hot coffee, of the charcoal smoke from cooking fires that had begun before dawn. Don Manuel waited near the gate to the plaza, wearing a face that had become oddly unreadable. He had paid for the spectacle, and yet he could not help the small tug of uncertainty that now had lodged in him, whether the horse's rage would be either contained or calmed. Sofía walked from the hacienda grounds with Maria at her side. She felt the crowd surround them as a texture, a many-voiced cloth. She counted the steps from the corral to the plaza gate. 1, 2, 3. She felt the stone of the gate under her fingertips. When they arrived at the open space, she found the center of the plaza was nothing but air and expectation. The officials were there. Don Ignacio with a ribbon across his chest, Dr. Hernandez in the early light, a scribe with a stiff-backed notebook. Don Manuel brought Esperanza into the plaza like a reluctant king. The horse's muscles gleamed under a sheen of sweat. He smelled like the night stables and the day's feed. He snorted when he saw the crowd and the plaza, with 1,000 small movements at once. Sofía stood before him. She had chosen to come without a bridle, as the terms demanded. She had practiced mounting with a log in a hand and a man steadying the mare's head. Now there would be no hidden supports. The horse tossed his head. He pawed at the dust. Someone in the edge of the crowd muttered that it would be a short spectacle. Sofía's hands found Esperanza's neck with the ease of habit. She felt the animal's muscles alive and prepared. Her voice was small, but it carried in a way that had nothing to do with volume. It had to do with the kind of presence only someone used to being in the dark can command. She hummed the song, the one that had become the thread of their days. 3 slow hums. A rising line, a fall. The crowd leaned forward as if to hear the sound more clearly. Ramon's jaw had bitten down taut. Paco's hat had been set on a knee as if to steady him. Don Manuel watched, folding his hands so that the fingers made a box. Sofía slipped a leg the way she had practiced, easing herself up with her hands and counting the angle of her knees. She found that she could feel Esperanza's back rise and fall beneath her like a slow, living mound. She did not clutch at the mane. She kept her fingers on the horse's flank. The animal's body had started to answer her rhythm. It did not bolt. He stepped forward at her lightest cue, practiced in the corral where silence had been a rule. The crowd exhaled as one, a single long sound that filled the sky. Men came forward to measure whether what they had seen matched the strictness of the rule. The horse's gait, the calmness in his eye, the absence of bridle or saddle. A doctor called for a moment of stillness. The plaza fell to a hush as thick as wool. Sofía kept her voice inside her head and hummed the closing phrase like a thread tying 2 hands together. Esperanza's steps were not perfect. They were tentative and then surer, like a person learning to find the edge of a floor in the dark. The officials scribbled. Don Ignacio cleared his throat and pronounced with an air of formality that was also wonder that the prize would be awarded at once. Applause came, a sound like rain finally released. The crowd rushed forward in small clustered waves. Don Manuel's hand closed on his checkbook like a man pressing his palm to a wound. He had not expected to be moved. Ramon slipped away from the front and stood at the corral gate, his hands folded in a new gesture. Paco laughed, guffawing, and then quieted as if to make room for the gravity of that moment. Sofía slid down from Esperanza's back, and the animal stood as still as a carved thing. She felt the solidity of her own feet on the stone of the plaza, and the small tremor of joy that moves through the body when something the mind had counted as impossible is made true. People cried. The sound threaded through the crowd like a sudden bright thread. Maria wept openly, her hands pressed to her mouth, disbelief and gratified fear braided in the same movement. The money was counted and placed on a table in the shade of the mesquite. 10 million pesos, a number that now had a face and a story and a small child's name. Don Ignacio read out a certificate of the hacienda's terms, his voice steady, his eyes glancing now and then at the 2 in the center. A girl who had never seen the sun and a horse who had never trusted men. Then came the question that had been waiting in the town like a hush under the wind. What would happen to the animal? Don Manuel, being practical by habit, spoke first. The prize is yours, Niña, but the horse must be sold to cover the costs of maintaining the herd. The hacienda cannot keep all such. Sofía felt a squeeze in her chest that was not pain, but a quick flash of ethics. Esperanza had become more than a prize object. She had become a companion. The idea that the horse would be branded and sold like a ledger entry made the breath go out of her in a small protesting hiss. Maria took her hand. "What do you want to do?" she asked, the question both a shelter and a sword. Sofía thought of the tin under the bed and of the surgeon's hands in the city. She thought of Ramon's leather strip on the gate and of Paco's grin, crumpled with honest feeling. She had not imagined the prize would land on them like a small domestic son. She did not want Esperanza to be a commodity. She did not want the town's generosity to be spent on something that would take the animal away from the life that had, with effort, been built. She also knew that if they could not pay the surgeon, the chance of light would be small. So she made the counting that children make when they are not only counting numbers, but also weighing kinds of hope. She remembered the tin, the 2 large coins, the scratch that made one coin imperfect, the offers Don Manuel had made. She thought of the safety of Maria's hands and of Dr. Salazar's measured hope. "I will buy Esperanza," she said quietly, "with 6 million, and I will take a job at the hacienda to work with the horses and to pay for the rest." The room, no, the plaza, hung there like a held breath. Don Manuel's face hardened for half a moment. Then, with the way men who calculate change, he made the arithmetic his hand. 6 million, he repeated, as if the number made its own argument. "And a position. And a place to keep her," Maria added before Sofía could say anything. She understood the negotiation as an offering of safety more than of commerce. Don Manuel studied them all, and then he sighed in some small human way. "You'll have work to do," he said, "and there will be no mercy for negligence. But if you can calm a beast the men could not, you can have a hand." The exchange was done with small formalities. The money changed hands with a bureaucratic clumsiness. Don Manuel's accountant, a man who smelled of ink and tobacco, tallied sums in an old fat ledger. The coins from the tin did not make the 7-digit number, but the 10 million prize did not require the 10. It was the town's applause and the officials' paperwork that made it real. Later, when the crowd thinned and the plaza's dust settled back into its grooves, Sofía sat with Maria under the mesquite and pressed a hand to the side of Esperanza's neck. The horse snorted softly and lifted his head like a man coming awake. Rain came again, thin at first, and the mesquite leaves clasped the drops like a shelter. Sofía hummed the song as a benediction. There would be more decisions to make. There would be the surgeon's schedule, the travel to the city, the care during the recovery, the adaptation to seeing, if seeing came at all. There would be people who remembered the town's tendency to gawk, and there would be those who quietly sent offerings, and there would be the ethical work of turning a prize into a vocation. But for now, there was the sound of coins in hands, the horses breathing, and the small song that had guided them this far. It was a beginning that smelled of wet earth and of the warm horse. When the train to the next day came, it would carry them to the surgeon's office, to a hospital with bright antiseptic smells, and to nights of new counting. But for that moment under the mesquite, with Maria's shawl around them, and Esperanza's warm flank against their palms, there was an answer in the simple shape of a girl who had decided to trust her own small courage. And Sofía kept counting. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, toward the city, toward surgery, toward the possibility of sight, toward the labor of making a sanctuary, if she and Maria could manage it. The town's laughter had quieted into applause, and in the hush of that applause, something like a new life began to be stitched. The horse's scars remained on his flank, and that was part of the truth. Healing, as Sofía had learned, does not erase history. It rearranges it. Night came, and the tin under the bed hummed with the memory of its coins. Sofía touched it and hummed her song, and let sleep pull her into a dark where small lights flickered like promises. Tomorrow would be the long road to the city, to Dr. Salazar, to surgeons who were careful, and to beds that smelled like paper and antiseptic. But the moment had already entered the ledger of their lives. Esperanza had been kept, and a child who had never seen the sun had led a frightened animal through the light of a town's wonder. As the hacienda settled and the menish voices dwindled to ordinary talk, Sofía whispered a prayer she had learned from Maria, one not long or ornate, but steady like a stitch. "Dios," she said into the dark, "guide our steps." The words were carried off by the mesquite leaves and returned as a soft rustle, as if the tree itself answered. For a girl who navigated the world by counting and song, the future had lengthened into a track she could place her feet on. The days ahead would be busy. The trip, the operation, the rehabilitation, the money paid out and portioned, the job at El Mesquite accepted. But tonight, in the low house with the warmed pot cooling on the hearth, Sofía and Maria slept with a peace that had been hard-earned. The horse, now called Esperanza, had a blanket that smelled of lime and of home. The town would remember the day in the plaza and tell it as a story of impossible things made possible by patience. And there was still the work to do, weeks of training ahead, a life to build that would be both sanctuary and work, a small community of people who would, in time, learn to value tenderness over force. For Sofía, who had never seen a mesquite in full light, there would be a day when sight came in pieces. When that day arrived, colors would not sweep in like a miracle, but like a careful unveiling. For now, she kept to her methods: counting, song, touch. She had taught an animal the language of patience, and in return, the world had opened a small door. Day 31 would bring the surgeon's timetable and the first real tests of what money could buy in the world of sterile medicine. But even as she prepared for the city, Sofía set another small intention like a pebble in a river. When she could, she would not merely keep Esperanza. She would make a place where other animals and other children who had been damaged might come and be taught the same lullaby of patience. She had already begun to imagine the sanctuary in pieces, the corral with soft corners, the blankets, a small stable where the smell of warm oats would be a healing thing rather than a threat. She could not yet see how that future would look, but she could hum the song into the night and press her palm to the horse's flank and count the steps she would take to get there. The tin of coins under the bed lay silent and sure, a small, resonant promise. And so, the story moved forward, into the city, into the surgeon's office, into the delicate business of whether and how sight could be restored. The horse waited at the hacienda, wrapped in his blanket, learning again the shape of a hand. Sofía prepared, in her hands and her voice and her counting, for the trials to come. They packed before dawn, when the air still kept the nights cool and the mesquite cast long, blue shadows across the courtyard. Sofía wrapped Esperanza's blanket again, smoothed the edges until the scent of lime and home felt like a shield. Maria counted aloud as she loaded a crate of preserved tamales and the tin with its small, clinking promise. The horse stamped once, anxious, then stood as if agreeing that the road, however long, must be walked. The village sent them off with bowls of broth and a few coins pressed into Maria's hand by neighbors who had not always understood but who now felt the pull of what had been done in the plaza. Children pressed faces to the railings and called goodbyes in a language of shy waves. Sofía walked beside the horse, one step, two steps, song humming in her throat like a mantra that kept the world steady beneath her feet. The road to the city was a slow unspooling of landscape, low hills giving way to scrub, fields opening into a stretch where farmers' houses flecked the horizon like hand-thrown stones. They traveled by borrowed wagon, the driver nodding but not speaking much. Some things, an animal led by a blind girl, sat outside ordinary speech. Sofía kept close to Esperanza, laying her palm along the horse's side, feeling the rise and fall of breath under the old scars. The animal's flanks trembled once and then steadied, learning the cadence of Sofía's counting. The city at first felt too large to hold. Buildings rose in lines and angles she had no map for, voices multiplied. Hospitals smelled of antiseptic and boiled linens and a different kind of promise than the one that had lived under the mesquite. Dr. Salazar met them in a corridor where light came through high windows and dust made the air soft. He had hands that were steady and eyes that did not flinch when Sofía explained, in halting phrases and with Maria's vocal steadiness, what had happened and what they hoped. "The eye can learn," he said, not a guarantee but a fact shaped by his years. "We can try." His Spanish had the clipped tenderness of someone who had spent his life in rooms where fate was negotiated one careful incision at a time. He examined Esperanza with a kind of respect Sofía had not expected a surgeon to give an animal, as if the horse were not simply a body but a ledger of events, scarred margins, tenderness, old pains recorded in muscle and nervousness. Surgery came like a held breath. There was a waiting room where Maria paced and hummed the same lullaby. Sofía had taught the horse. Sofía counted the tiles on the floor until numbers blurred into light. She had never felt so small and so large at once, small before sterile rooms and strange machines, large because in the palm of her hands she carried, in a sense, a third life, Esperanza's present and the sanctuary she had begun to imagine. When the surgeon returned, his face was careful in its relief. The operation had gone as planned. The damaged tissue had been repaired, infection held at bay. But he spoke of fragile things, nerves that would have to relearn, tissue that would scar, the slow education of sight itself. "It will not be an instant," he said. "It will be months. There will be good days and bad days. The eye can open like a door that needs time to swing." On the drive back, Maria held Esperanza's halter. The horse walked with a stiffness and then a gradual willingness, as if trying to remember old rules for trusting human hands. Sofía felt a tightening in her chest that was both fear and hope. She had been brave for the horse. She had been brave when the crowd laughed and when she led the animal to the plaza. Now bravery took on a different shape, a patient ache that would ask for constancy. The days of recovery taught them subtler patience than the village had ever needed. Dr. Salazar visited twice a week, pronouncing progress in small triumphs. Less redness, a reflex there where none had been, a cautious blank. Sofía developed new counting systems. How many times Esperanza lowered her head to eat without flinching, how many steps she took in a straight line without veering, how many breaths she took before sighing. In the mornings, she sang into the horse's ear. At night, she pressed her hand to the warm flank and repeated the prayer she had learned under the mesquite. Rehabilitation was not a list of exercises, but a reteaching of the world. Sofía led Esperanza through a series of gentle revelations. A ribbon tied to a post so the horse could learn to associate movement with touch. A row of clay pots arranged by size so that the horse could learn relative shapes by scent and sound. Soft-colored cloths wafted at a distance so that the animal began to pair color with the songs Sofía hummed. The first time Esperanza tracked the fabric with an eye that did not simply glaze over, but followed. Sofía pressed her face to the horse's neck and wept. The tears were not about a miracle as much as about recognition, proof that the labor of faith could have a visible echo. Sofía herself began to wake to new things in stages. Sight came not in one flood, but in a series of taped open windows. A blur, then an edge, then a patch of color. She saw the mesquite from a distance and could at first only name it by pattern. Sharp silhouette, crown, leaves. The world was a book with pages that turned slowly. Colors were not overwhelming. They arrived like careful brushstrokes. The first red she perceived was not the bright, full red of postcards, but a small, found red, Maria's shawl folded on the chair, a raspberry stain in cloth. When she recognized it by name aloud, the sound registered like a bell. The sanctuary that had been mostly imagination while the horse lay under bandages began to take shape in small, practical steps. Sofía secured a little ground near the hacienda, an old chicken yard with upright posts that could be repaired, a lean-to where straw could be kept dry. They mended fences and built corners softened with old sacks and bales. Word spread in a different fashion now, not the loud, startled gossip of the plaza, but a quieter word of mouth. A neighbor brought a lame goat. A boy came with a terrier that flinched at sudden movements. An old woman asked if there might be a place to leave her tired donkey on days when she could not manage him alone. Sofía taught with the same tools that had helped Esperanza: counting, song, touch. She showed children how to place a hand and let the animal accept it. She taught older women how to read a horse's eye for signs of fear rather than assuming stubbornness. People who had always reached for force began, hesitantly, to try gentleness. The work asked for a different currency than the village had practiced: time, attention, the humility to stop being sure one knew all the answers. There were setbacks. A storm broke a week after their return. Wind ripped at roofs and the river rose, turning paths to mud. A mare in the field panicked and threw a foal that would never stand. Sofía learned the weight of grief that was not her own, but that bound her to others. She kept her counting and sang louder, but songs could only do so much in the face of loss. The village gathered, hands and blankets and silence, teaching Sofía that sorrow can become a seam that binds people rather than disunites them. At the sanctuary's slow growth, a friction emerged with the older ways. Some men who had earned animals as labor saw no reason to change usual methods. A few scoffed when Sofía suggested gentleness as strategy rather than merely a kindness. They came to the corral, sharp of voice, doubt in their eyes. Sofía met them with the steady patience that had been her currency, demonstrations rather than arguments. She led a frightened colt into the yard, let it feel the soft cornered post, sung into its ear until it calmed. The colt calmed. Spectators, even skeptics, noticed. That kind of answer carried farther than any speech. A small miracle, if miracles can be counted, occurred the day a little girl from town arrived clutching a battered picture book. She had a limp in her walk, and her family had long heard that the sanctuary might be a place of refuge. Sofía sat on a stump and read aloud, letting the girl's hand rest on Esperanza's flank. As the girl listened, she traced the horse's spine, then, guided by Sofía's voice, placed her fingers over the horse's eye and felt the pupil contract at her touch. She laughed, a bright, unguarded sound, and ran her fingertips along the horse's mane. The laughter moved through the crowd like spring. With time, the horse's sight improved enough that Sofía could do a small thing she had been waiting for: walk Esperanza to the plaza for the market day, not as spectacle, but as patient participant. The horse moved with a measured pride, head high and ears alert. People who had seen the old horse when it trembled in the shadows now met it with nods. Children reached out, and Sofía taught them how to fold a hand rather than thrust it, how to let the animal come in its own time. Sofía's own sight never became a dramatic unveiling. There were parts of the world she still navigated by counting and touch, but now she could learn the shape of someone's face before they spoke, could see the way a cloud made a stripe across the sun. There were colors she had always loved in her mind and now could match to things in the hollow of her hand. Sight added a vocabulary to her counting. It did not replace the numbers, but layered them. She would sometimes stand at the edge of the sanctuary at dusk, fingers pressed to Esperanza's flank, and watch the sky take on hues she had once only imagined. She would hum the old prayer again and feel, in the ratcheting down of daylight, how each small labor had rearranged the day's ledger. Years softened some edges of the story. The sanctuary became a place known in neighboring towns. Not a grand institution, but a modest haven where hands that had once been used for work learned to be gentle. Children who were nervous around animals grew into young men and women who could read a horse's ear like another person's mood. A couple from the city sent donations, 2 sacks of grain, then more, after reading of Esperanza's recovery in a paper that found its way to town. The tin under the bed had long since been emptied to pay for the surgeon's fees, but money, humble, slow money, found other forms: bread, tools, a volunteer who had been a stable hand, later a teacher who offered to give sewing lessons for the blankets the sanctuary made and sold to keep straw in the winter. There were small festivals now, not the kind that turned animals into contests, but days when the sanctuary opened its gate and the town came to bring food and to learn how to touch without fear. In one such afternoon, Sofía stood by a new corral she had helped design. Soft corners, mats, and a simple sign painted by children. Gasta de Esperanza. The lettering was uneven. A child's hand had painted the final stroke with a surety that made Sofía smile. Maria stood beside her, older but steady, the shawl no longer the same faded cloth, but kept as a relic of first steps and first litters of hope. At times, memory rose, as if the past were a riverbank they had stepped away from but could see across the water. Sofía would think of the horse's first day in the plaza, of the laughter that had been curiosity and cruelty both, of how she had led with nothing but a counting song and a stubbornness that felt like a vow. She never pretended the world had changed entirely. Cruelty and brusqueness still existed, but there were now more hands that would stop and listen rather than act in haste. There were more people who knew how to put their palm flat and wait. One evening, as the sun warmed the ground and the sanctuary settled into its ordinary hum, Sofía walked the perimeter with Esperanza at her side. The horse nosed at the new sign and then lowered its head as if in acknowledgement. Sofía felt an old, soft fear. What if this was all temporary? And beneath it, a stronger thing, confidence made of stitches. She sat on the low step of the lean-to and watched a boy guide a skittish goat into a pen. The boy counted slowly, aloud, and the animal calmed in the space of his voice. Sofía hummed her song under her breath and felt the sound link her to that boy, to Maria, to Dr. Salazar, to every neighbor who had offered a bowl of broth. Each act had been a stitch. None had erased the horse's scars or their own, but each had rearranged the fabric into something that held. When she raised her eyes, the mesquite was visible beyond the fence, a distant silhouette against a sky that was the color of cooled metal. For a moment the world balanced, the long road back and the many shorter ones they had chosen each morning. Sofía laid her hand on Esperanza's flank, the old scars as warm as memory, and counted, as always, 1, 2, 3. Behind those numbers stretched the path they had taken, not miracle in a single blaze, but the slow, exact work of making a place where tenderness might be learned and kept. The horse stamped and nuzzled her palm. She hummed the song and let the light gather into manageable pieces, like fabric folded and handed to a child who is learning to sew. And in the hush, as dusk stitched itself across the field, Sofía spoke the prayer she had carried for so long. It was simple, not ornate, a thanks for hands that had helped, a request for strength for the days to come, the steady acceptance that history would remain, but could be mended. Esperanza breathed against her hand. The sanctuary's gate closed for the night. Children ran home. When stars took their places, somewhere a neighbor added a small lantern outside their door. The work would continue. There would be days of mud and days of laughter, of loss and small, stubborn joy. Sofía understood this now more fully than she had at the beginning, when a girl's courage first led a frightened animal through a strange town. She had learned that healing rearranged but did not erase. It taught patience, required stubbornness, asked that one keep counting even when the numbers blurred. She rose and walked slowly along the fence with the horse at her side. The mesquite leaves rustled as if in answer. She pressed her hand once more to Esperanza's flank and whispered, as she had under that tree so many nights ago, "Dios guía nuestros pasos." The words sank into the evening like a stitch closing a seam. They stepped into the world they had made, small, careful, alive with the labor of many hands. Their history remained, with its marks and scars, But in the place between past and future, they had sown a shelter that would hold others who were wounded and teach them by touch and song how to stand again.